What's up guys, Asian here again with another build video, and today we're going over the Magicka Warden DPS. So Magicka Wardens are in a little bit of a weird spot right now when it comes to how people perceive them. In dummy parses, they do fairly well. They're probably one of the better dummy parsers out there when it comes to Magicka DPS. However, in a trial, their DPS does go down much more than what you would anticipate. Now, while Wardens did receive a fairly significant buff in Greymoor, with pets now able to inherit certain stats and features that the character has, for example, the Bloodthirsty trait on Jewels, you're still running the pet. So that's one of the big kind of weaknesses of the Magicka Warden, is the fact that you're basically relying on the bear ultimate to do a lot of your damage. So if the bear ultimate ends up being hard CC'd or stunned or is acting weird because of its combat AI, then your DPS ends up going down by quite a bit in an actual trial environment. That being said, though, Magicka Wardens, just like other DPS specs, are more than capable of putting out enough DPS to clear pretty much all content in the game. But they are heavily reliant on that bear, so if you're in a fight where the bear AI is not going to be cooperating with you, or the bear is getting CC'd, then your DPS will end up seeing quite a bit of a drop compared to what you would expect to see on a target dummy. Just like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any sort of gear. That is covered in the Magicka DPS gear video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. This video will be focusing in on the skills and the rotations that you should be using. So let's go ahead and get started. Starting off with our front bar, we have Blood for Blood as our main spamble. Next we have a Deep Fissure, Fetcher Infection, Blue Betty, and Inner Light. We are also running Eternal Guardian as our ultimate of choice. As you can imagine, you will have a double bar this, so on your back bar, we have Winter's Revenge, Unstable Wall of Fire, Barbed Trap, Mystic Orb, Inner Light again, and Eternal Guardian. Now you can swap out Inner Light on this back bar for something else, like a shield or a self-heal if you need to. Same thing with the front bar, you can replace Inner Light with a shield or another ability that you feel like you will need to improve your overall survivability. Kind of up to you what you want to use here. Now, for those of you guys who do not want to be a vampire or do not want to use Blood for Blood as your primary spamble, instead you'll be using Screaming Cliff Racer instead as your main spamble. The benefit of running Screaming Cliff Racer is you do have a way to set enemies off balance, so you do help with off balance uptime here, plus you end up it does a little bit more damage the further away you are from the enemy, so it is potentially a good replacement for Blood. Now, the downside is, by running Screaming Cliff Racer, you're going to end up using Magicka for your spamble rather than health, so you will end up eating into your sustain by using Screaming Cliff Racer. So by running Screaming Cliff Racer, you will need an organized raid group in order to fully sustain your rotation. It is fairly difficult to sustain Screaming Cliff Racer as a Magicka Warden without some sort of group support, for example, Hollow Fang, Worm, Symmetry Blades, the Massive Restoration Staff, etc., etc. The other possible spamble that you want to run is going to be Crushing Force Pulse. Force Pulse does have a little bit of cleave behind it, costs the exact same amount of Magicka as Screaming Cliff Racer does, it just has some additional cleave. So if you want raw single target damage, then you're going to want to go with Screaming Cliff Racer or Blood for Blood. If you want the cleave, Force Pulse is probably going to be the best spamble for you to use. That pretty much covers it for all of our skills. Now let's go ahead and talk about the rotation. The rotation, despite the fact that we are running Blood for Blood, pretty much remains exactly the same as it has been in the past. You're still going to be centering your rotation around Deep Fissure. Deep Fissure acts as essentially a 3-second dot. So what you're going to do is you're going to be doing Deep Fissure, then 2 abilities, Deep Fissure, and then 2 abilities. Now you might be concerned that Blood for Blood does cost health. However, because we have a lot of abilities that we need to cast here, which is Revenge, Unstable Wall, Barbed Trap, Mystic Orb, then we have Fetcher Infection, you're actually not going to be using your spamble very often, all things considered. So even though it does cost health, Blood for Blood actually isn't going to reduce your health by a whole lot, even in a trial dummy parse. In an actual raid environment where you have a healer that's able to heal you through the damage that you're taking from using Blood for Blood, it actually becomes even easier to sustain your rotation that way. But As a demonstration of your rotation, it's actually fairly simple. Make sure to pre-buff with your Betty first. Then go ahead and start off. You can see here it's basically 2 abilities and then Deep Fissure. And then when you don't have any dots to renew, that's when you use Blood for Blood. You can see here that you're actually not going to end up using Blood for Blood very often, all things considered, because you have so many dots that you need to maintain. You can see here that I still haven't used Blood for Blood yet. This is actually the first time I used Blood for Blood in quite a while. So, despite the fact that Blood for Blood does end up using health, with the amount of dots that you have to maintain as a Magicka Warden, it actually ends up being fairly easy to sustain it health-wise by using Blood for Blood, just because you're not using it very often. Let's go ahead and reset the dummy so our bear stops keeping us in combat here. Now, if you are concerned with running Blood for Blood, for example, your healer might not necessarily be as good, they might be dying a lot, one thing you could do instead is you could run something like Lotus Blossom in order to heal yourself up. Now, just bear in mind that it doesn't necessarily heal you, it heals you or a nearby ally, so it could heal somebody else instead. But again, if you're using this particular rotation, then you will be using a lot of dots in between Blood for Blood, so that shouldn't be that big of an issue. It should be hitting you enough to heal you through the damage that you'd be taking with Blood for Blood. But if you are concerned about the health costs and you want to use some sort of self-heal, a passive self-heal, then you can be running something like Lotus Blossom instead, if you don't necessarily trust your healer to keep you up from the cost of running Blood for Blood. But that's up to you. If you are going to be using Lotus Blossom, just put it on your back bar in place of Inner Light here. But that pretty much covers it for the rotation. The best way to see it is going to be through a dummy parse. Now, I want to keep everybody in mind here that this is a dummy parse. This is not a trial parse. So in an actual trial, we're going to have a couple of things that are going to be different compared to in a dummy environment. First of all, we are missing a couple of buffs on the trial dummy. We are missing things like Minor Courage, we are missing Major Vulnerability, Zen's Martial Knowledge, etc. We're also missing some sustain buffs, so we're missing things like Hollow Fang's Thirst, we're missing the Master's Restoration Staff, we're missing Symphony of Blades. While we are using Ghastly Eyeball to sort of mimic in-raid sustain bonuses, we actually do still have higher sustain in raids, so if you are having trouble sustaining on a trial dummy, just keep in mind that in an organized raid group, you will be having more sustain buffs from your support roles, so you might not see those same detriments in an actual raid environment. In a raid environment, we also have mechanics that you're going to have to deal with, so that also ends up reducing our DPS. Don't necessarily use the trial dummy parse as an indication of what you should see a Magicka Warden pull in a raid environment. You should be using this as a way to compare across different classes and across different Magicka Wardens, because the trial dummy does standardize parses by applying the same buff and debuff, the exception being, of course, necromancers with their major vulnerability. Now, with all that said and done, let's go ahead and get started here with our parse. Again, pre-buff with your Betty and use whatever source of Minor Force you have, whether that's going to be Barb Trap like I have here, or Channeled Acceleration. Oops. I cast Deep Fissure a little bit early there. Not that big of a deal. You can see here that your rotation is going to be fairly dynamic just because of the way all of our dots seem to line up with each other. Again, you can see here that I'm actually not using Blood for Blood very often here because we have to keep an eye on so many dots here. It's actually going to be fairly rare that you're going to be using Blood for Blood twice in a row. can see here that I'm actually letting some of my dots run completely out and prioritizing certain dots over others. The ones you're really going to want to prioritize are going to be pretty much most of your back bar dots. You can avoid casting Fissure Infection here and there, just because if you do have a Warden Healer, your Warden Healer will typically be the one using Fissure Infection. All of your back bar dots are going to be the most important to maintain. And then just make sure to use your ultimate as soon as you get it. Now in execute phase, nothing is changing with our rotations. Wardens don't have an execute. The bear does have deal additional damage in execute range, but because it's an ultimate, you can't obviously use it on demand. So it's not really an execute. And there we go. That is the Magicka Warden Parse there. So, see here we pulled 86.3k here. The bear is now affected by Bloodthirsty, so you can see that we're getting very, very big hits here. 175.8k when we use our ultimate. This is the ultimate cast when you actually cast the ultimate. Crushing Swipe and Bite are the two standard attacks that the bear will use here. And you can see that it actually does do quite a bit of DPS when you combine it all together. It ends up contributing over 10k DPS, or I should say just under 10k DPS when you combine them all together here, which is why when the bear AI doesn't work as you want it to, that's where things get a little bit tricky, because now the bear is not contributing as much DPS, which ends up dropping your DPS by a significant margin potentially, depending on how badly the bear is not able to do things. So for example, in Sunspire, Crushing Swipe actually doesn't manage to hit the dragon, so you're actually losing out on 4k DPS, dropping us down to about 82.3k instead, which is a fairly sizable drop in overall damage. So that's something you want to keep in mind. If you're going to be running the Magicka Warden, you're going to be heavily reliant on the bear. If the bear will work, then you actually do fairly respectable amounts of damage. But if the bear doesn't work, then that's where your DPS will start to fall off by a pretty steep margin. But again, despite all of that, Magicka Wardens are still more than capable of pulling out enough DPS to do pretty much all the content in the game. That pretty much covers it for this build. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.